something is happening right now. In the trees outside your window, in the branches above your morning walk, in the sky above your yard, and you have never once been told about it. The birds you glance at every day, the ones you barely register, the sparrows and crows and robins and jays, they are watching you. Not the way a pet watches you, not passively. They are studying you with a level of precision that would disturb you if you understood what they were actually doing. And the strangest part? They're not keeping it to themselves. The moment you step outside, before you've even looked up, word is already moving through the trees about you, specifically about you. Most people go their entire lives never realizing this is happening. But once you know, once you feel the weight of what these creatures are actually transmitting, you will never hear bird song the same way again. What you thought was silence was never silent. The yard you thought was empty? It wasn't. It was full of conversation, and you were the subject. Let's go back to a single moment, a specific kind of morning you've probably experienced without knowing what it meant. You step outside. Maybe you're carrying coffee. Maybe you're walking to your car. And for just a second, everything in the yard goes quiet. The sparrows stop. The finches freeze. Even the leaves seem to hold still. And then, just as quickly, the sound returns. But it's different now. More alert. More urgent. There's a sharpness to it that wasn't there before. You noticed it maybe, and then you didn't think about it again. But here's what was actually happening in that moment. Every bird within earshot had just received a signal. Not a vague one. A precise, layered transmission containing information about the size of the threat, the direction it was moving, and in ways that researchers are only beginning to fully understand. Whether that threat was familiar. Whether that threat had been seen before. Whether that threat was you. In the world of birds, silence is one of the loudest things that can happen. And you triggered it. The science behind this begins with something called the alarm call, and it is far more sophisticated than a simple screech of danger. Researchers at the University of Washington spent years studying American crows, and what they discovered quietly rewrote everything we thought we knew about animal intelligence. These birds don't just react to threats, they remember faces. They catalog human individuals the way a security system catalogs intruders. And crucially, they share that information. In one study, scientists wore specific masks while handling crows they had captured. Those same crows, once released, began scolding the masked researchers every single time they reappeared. Not other people, not other researchers, specifically the faces associated with the original threat. And the unsettling detail that most people miss when they hear about this study is what happened next. Other crows. Birds that had never once encountered those masks. Birds that had never been handled or threatened also began scolding. They had learned the face from the warnings of others. The information had traveled. A portrait of a specific human had been passed invisibly through the flock. The crow that dive-bombed you 2 summers ago told its neighbors about you. And some of those neighbors told theirs. But crows are only the beginning, and what's happening in the rest of the bird world goes even deeper and stranger than that. There is a phenomenon researchers call the mobbing call, and it operates across species lines in a way that should not, by any logical measure, be possible. When a hawk lands in a tree above your feeder, the chickadees don't just warn other chickadees. Their alarm call contains embedded acoustic information, patterns of frequency and repetition that encodes the size and danger level of the predator. A small predator gets one kind of call. A large, slow-moving hawk gets another. A fast, highly dangerous falcon gets something closer to pure silence. A hiss, because silence carries further without giving away position. And every species in the yard understands this code. The sparrows react. The nuthatches respond. The robins shift posture. In moments, every bird within range has assembled a shared, real-time picture of a threat they may not even be able to see directly. They are running a distributed surveillance network, and they've been doing it for millions of years, long before we built anything like it. What takes your breath away is this: you are always somewhere in that picture. The question that keeps researchers awake, the one that starts to feel almost philosophical if you sit with it long enough, is exactly how specific this identity mapping gets. And the answer keeps pushing further than anyone expected. A study out of Cornell University found that certain bird species don't just recognize familiar threats, they appear to categorize them. A person who regularly fills a feeder gets one kind of treatment. A person who walks past without interacting gets another. A person who once startled a nest gets something else entirely. And that label, once assigned, is extraordinarily hard to shake. Think about what that means for a moment. There is a bird somewhere in your neighborhood, possibly multiple birds, that has placed you into a category, not as a human, not as a generic presence, but as a specific individual with a specific history. And when you walk outside, that category is quietly transmitted in acoustic signals your ears can't fully parse. To every bird nearby, you have a reputation. You have always had one. You just didn't know it was being written. Now here's where the hidden architecture of this system becomes genuinely staggering, because the alarm calls and mobbing responses are just the layer you might notice. Beneath them, running constantly, at frequencies and subtleties that blend seamlessly into what we just call birdsong, is something that functions almost like ambient broadcast. Researchers studying the dawn chorus, that explosion of birdsong at first light that most of us sleep through, have found that it contains information about overnight events, territorial boundaries, the presence or absence of predators, and the current health and status of individual singers. It is a morning briefing, a reset of the shared picture, and embedded in that chorus are the updates from the night before, including any threats that moved through the area while the neighborhood was dark and quiet. Your presence, if you were out the previous evening, may have been noted. Your movements may have been discussed in the only way birds discuss anything, in layered acoustic code before the sun rose on your yard. That song you woke up to this morning? It may have included you. There is something else, something that operates not in sound at all, but in behavior, in posture, in the geometry of how birds position themselves when a specific person enters a space. Ornithologists who spend time in the field develop a practice of reading what's called flush distance, the distance at which a bird will fly away when approached. In areas with no hunting, birds in parks and urban spaces allow humans to come remarkably close. But the flush distance changes. It changes based on body language. It changes based on what you're carrying. It changes based on whether the birds have learned from experience that you are safe. And the reverse is equally true. In studies of urban crow populations, researchers noted that certain individuals would allow wildlife biologists who had previously captured and banded them to approach no closer than 40 meters. They had permanently revised their flush distance for that specific face, that specific human. And when those same biologists walked through the area, nearby birds that hadn't been handled also shifted. The anxiety was contagious. The identity of the threat was communicated, even in the absence of sound, through the behavioral changes of the birds who knew. You don't always need to make a sound to send a message through the yard. Sometimes your presence alone is the broadcast. What makes this feel almost otherworldly is when you layer in what we now know about how far and how fast this information travels. Birds don't stay in one territory. They move. They winter elsewhere, migrate through shared corridors, visit feeding areas across wide ranges. And the social connections between them, the relationships that form at feeders, at roost sites, along migration flyways, mean that information about a specific human can, theoretically, travel extraordinary distances. A study following individual black-capped chickadees using radiotelemetry found that information about a novel food source spread through a local population in under 48 hours, not because every bird found it directly, but because they followed and learned from birds they trusted. The same mechanism that spreads the location of a feeder can spread the identity of a threat. The same social trust that makes a flock efficient makes it a living, breathing communications network. Your yard is not isolated. It is a node, and the birds that pass through it are carrying data, including data about you, across a web that extends far beyond anything you can see from your window. Now sit with the full weight of what this actually means. because this is the part that tends to stop people. You have walked through parks. You have scared pigeons. You have shooed birds from a patio, startled a blackbird from a bush, walked under a nesting tree without knowing it was there. You have had thousands of interactions with birds over the course of your life. Interactions you dismissed the moment they ended, and from each of those encounters, there was information that didn't end when you walked away. It was carried. It was processed. It was, in some form, shared. The birds were not passive scenery. They were active observers. They were running a constant, real-time assessment of every human who moved through their environment, encoding the results and passing them forward through a system so integrated, so ancient, so effortlessly distributed that it makes our own information networks look newly built by comparison. You have been part of this system your entire life. You simply weren't told. But here's the thing that shifts everything, the detail that turns what might feel unsettling into something that lands closer to reverence. The same system that tracks threats also tracks safety. The same neural architecture that helps a crow remember a dangerous face helps it remember a kind one. The same mobbing call network that warns birds away from a person who threatened a nest also falls gradually, measurably silent around a person who has been consistently gentle. The birds in your yard are not only watching for danger, they are watching for its absence. They are building, over time, a portrait of you that goes beyond threat assessment into something that researchers have started to call, carefully, cautiously, trust. When a bird at your feeder doesn't flush as you approach, it is not being careless. It is giving you information. It is telling you what it has concluded about you. Based on every morning it has watched you move through that space, every time you filled the feeder without startling it, every time you passed by without harm, it has assessed you. It has run the calculation, and it has decided, in whatever way a bird decides anything, that you are safe. That is not nothing. That is, in its own quiet way, a relationship. And it was built in a language you didn't even know was being spoken. Researchers at Exeter University found that individual great tits, small birds, unremarkable to most people, were able to form distinct behavioral responses to specific human individuals in as few as 4 days of regular exposure. 4 days. After 4 days of watching the same person move through their environment, they had built a working model of that person's behavior, and they adjusted accordingly. The birds that received food without disruption began approaching sooner. The birds that had experienced disturbance stayed distant and kept that distance. The invisible judgment had already been rendered. The file was already written. And what's quietly astonishing is that this isn't an edge case, a special talent of an unusually intelligent species. It is a baseline capacity, expressed across dozens of bird families, refined across tens of millions of years of evolution in environments where reading the individual intent of a large, dangerous creature could mean the difference between living and not. The birds did not develop this to be remarkable. They developed it to survive. And in surviving, they built something that we are only now, with all our science and wonder, beginning to see clearly. Step outside tomorrow morning. Stand still for a moment before you do anything else. Listen to what happens to the sound around you. Notice whether the calls shift when you appear. Notice whether a particular bird follows you, or whether one flushes earlier than the rest. Notice whether, at your regular feeder, the birds already know when you're coming, whether they begin to stir before you've even opened the door. Because they might. They might already know your footstep from your neighbors. They might have already filed the sound of your specific door, the pattern of your particular mornings, the weight of your presence in their world. And in the branches above you, in the wires, in the rooftops, in the upper canopy where you almost never look, the assessment is ongoing. The transmission is continuous. The network is always running. You are not just in the yard. You are in the picture. You have always been in the picture. And somewhere right now, in a tree not far from where you're sitting, a bird is watching the light change and deciding, on the basis of everything it has learned, whether you are a threat to be warned about, or a presence so familiar, so consistent, so quietly woven into the fabric of that particular place that it no longer sends a signal at all. Maybe you've earned that silence. Maybe, without ever trying, Without ever knowing this language existed, you have been building something. Morning by morning, season by season, in the minds of the creatures that watch your yard. Maybe the truest measure of how you move through the world is not what you say or do among other people. Maybe it's what happens to the birds when you walk outside. The silence they give you, or the warning they send, that is your real reputation, and it's been kept, faithfully and honestly, in a language older than anything we've ever written. Have you ever had a moment, a morning in your yard, a walk through a park, a quiet second where a bird looked at you differently, where you felt, just for an instant, that it knew something about you? Tell me what happened.